like, on behalf of COMEXI, to welcome Kristie De Peña, the Senior Vice President for Policy and Director of Immigration Policy at the Niskanen Center. She earned her LLM in National Security and Foreign Policy from George Washington University School of Law, and her GD from the University of Iowa College of Law. De Peña is a prolific and well-known commentator on immigration issues, frequently contributing to newspapers or all sorts of news outlets like the New York Times, Time Magazine, USA Today, Bloomberg, Washington Examiner, National Review, The Hill, Newsweek, and others. She was named one of the most influential people shaping policy in 2024 by the Washingtonian. Welcome, Kristie. Thank you for joining us in this seminar. I would like to introduce as well, very quickly, Héctor Cárdenas, who will be the commentator. Kristie will be the main speaker. Héctor Cárdenas holds a PhD and a master's in public policy from the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley, as well as a master's in public administration from the prestigious ENA, École Nacional de Administración, and a BA in International Relations from el Colegio de México. He is a member of COMEXI's board and president and CEO of the Ergo Group, a public policy and international technology strategy consulting firm. Thank you, Héctor, for agreeing to comment on Kristie's presentation.
Thank you.
My name is Celia Toro, I'm Vice President of COMEXI, Professor of International Relations at the Colegio de México, and I will be the moderator. We will be talking this morning. We will be talking this morning about the so-called Project 2025, published recently by the Heritage Foundation, published last year. This project, which is more than 900 pages long, is meant to be a guide, a wish list, they call it a mandate for a possible second Trump administration. We will focus only on what the document recommends when it comes to immigration policy. The Niskanen Center has looked carefully into this publication, and Kristie De Peña will share with us her ideas on the likely impact of Project 2025. As we all know, U.S. immigration policy is of paramount importance for Mexico, as Mexicans have been the largest group of immigrants in that country for over the last 3 or 4 decades. Although the large Mexican wave of immigration has reached its peak, so that's behind, but still. It is of paramount importance because although Mexican nationals are not a significant part of the recent arrival of asylum seekers at the U.S. southern border, and the number of encounters or apprehensions of Mexicans at the border, at the southern border, is at a historic low, is the lowest ever. Mexicans still represent the first foreign minority in 35 states in the United States. While most Mexicans living in the United States today are documented, and the undocumented are no longer the majority of the unauthorized population in the US, they are still around 5 million people. US immigration policy is of paramount importance because more than half of the so-called dreamers are of Mexican descent. Their parents are Mexican. And because most of the H-2A visa holders in the US are Mexican temporary workers, mostly in the agricultural sector. And last but not least, and something we should really not underestimate, is the political discourse, in particular of Donald Trump, that points at Hispanics, Mexicans in particular, as a threat to US identity, as a threat to US safety, and as an unwelcome presence in US polity. This discourse opens the door to violent behavior, and to systematic discrimination against migrants of Hispanic origin. So immigration and asylum policy in the coming years will definitely affect, for better or worse, many Mexicans living in the United States. So, Kristie, you have the floor. Please be my guest and start. Tell us, how can this happen? How is this likely to happen? Thank you.
Well, first, thank you both so much for the invitation to speak with you all today. It is really a privilege to be here and to join you, Celia and Hector. So I want to kind of start by talking a little bit about what drove us to do this analysis at the time that we did. We published this paper in February of this year, just several months after the most recent mandate came out. So for 40 years, the Heritage Foundation, which is a center or a far-right leaning organization, sort of depending on the policy area, they have published a regular iteration of what they call this mandate for leadership. Importantly, the Trump administration implemented about 64% of the recommendations from the 2016 version of this document just within the first year of his presidency during his administration. So it is clear that even though candidate Trump and the Trump-Vance ticket are taking a lot of pains to distance themselves from the mandate this year, it is clear that it has a heavy influence on how they approach policy. And the fact that many of the authors were also influential people in the Trump administration the first time around is another indication that they are certainly going to consider many of these proposals, if not all of them, in a second administration. So we were a little surprised by what Trump did in the last administration, but we wanted to really dive into this blueprint because we want to know exactly what is coming around this time. And I think the second piece of that puzzle is that we strongly felt like the media in the US was sort of missing the mark on Project 2025. There are a lot of headlines about some of the kind of big campaign rhetoric proposals that President Trump is talking about. The one that immediately comes to mind is, of course, on mass deportations, which is alarming for many reasons. But there are so many other pieces that are going to make this an incredibly comprehensive and problematic course that are, not as headline grabbing, that people aren't as interested in. They delve a lot into guidelines and policy and process. And we really wanted to bring those to light for people to understand, really how devastating this is going to be for both legal immigration, humanitarian immigration, and also for the undocumented populations that have often been targeted by the campaign when they talk about mass deportations. So all told, we've really been trying to frame this as, not a refresh of first term ideas that are dusted off and kind of ready to be re-implemented. This is perhaps one of the most meticulously orchestrated and comprehensive plans that I have ever seen to drive immigration levels to unprecedented lows, and importantly, to really increase the level of federal government power that we have seen in many years. So I want to highlight two quick themes, and I hope that we can have a discussion about some of the things, the other pieces that we brought up. Two of the themes that we thought were really important is that this administration is going to use bureaucracy to really break down nearly every immigration program by kind of gumming up the guidelines, adding in procedural hurdles that are going to help redirect discretionary spending. And this is all done in an effort to circumvent the involvement of the courts, which was pretty powerful during the first Trump administration. Via the use of nationwide injunctions, the a lot of the proposals that came directly from President Trump himself or from some of the agencies ended up being stymied by the courts. They are looking very actively and have laid out what I think is an incredibly smart plan to reduce the impact of the court's involvement moving forward. The second theme is that there are lots of efforts to really coerce the states into complying with the mandates that will come from the federal government. And that comes in a lot of different ways, whether it's through university enrollment protocols, whether it's through conditioning funding for other mechanisms on cooperation with the federal government, but there are a whole host of things sort of tucked into this 920-page document that is going to really force the states to have to comply or risk losing funding that they frankly rely on for, to keep their states running. So on the weaponizing bureaucracy, I just want to highlight a couple of examples. Celia, I'm glad that you brought up the H-2 program because it is one of the things that I think is tucked in there and that a lot of people aren't going to pay close attention to. So the mandate calls out this intention for Congress to ultimately wind down the H-2 programs over the next 10 to 20 years. That is not in and of itself a surprise. However, in the interim, it also instructs the Secretary of Homeland Security not to issue any updates to the list of H-2 eligible countries. So even though this is a program that is in our statute, DHS and DOS, our Department of State, work together to publish an annual list of eligible countries in our Federal Register. That defines which countries' nationals will be eligible for an H-2 visa program. And they, do a lot of risk evaluations. They analyze prior overstay rates. And as Celia rightly pointed out, this is one of the main ways that we employ a lot of Mexican workers in the United States temporarily. By refusing to update this list after it expires, no countries will be eligible as a whole to participate in the program, which means that there will still be the availability to have a case-by-case exemption for an individual worker. But of course, this is going to increase significantly the burden on any petitioning employers, raising the bar not only from demonstrating their own need is doing so in the national interest, which is part of the calculation, but they have to do that for every single individual that they would like to extend an H-2 visa to, as opposed to a group of individuals from an eligible country. So there is almost no world where employers are going to be able to effectively utilize this visa if that eligible countries list is not updated. The second example that I think brings this idea of weaponizing bureaucracy to the forefront is the proposed requirement that the Fraud Detection and National Security Directorate Office sign off on every approved application or petition before approval notices are issued. So in the US, the FDNS is tasked, of course, with detecting fraud. They sort of conduct unannounced visits, site visits. They look at compliance reviews. They will occasionally look at applications or petitions if they are flagged for a high suspicion of fraud. Their annual case completion rate is around 35,000 cases in any good year. USCIS, which processes all of our applications and petitions, processes about 8.6 million applications, petitions, and requests in any given year. So it is not a stretch to assume that requiring the FDNS to review 8.6 million applications and petitions, as opposed to the caseload of about 35,000, is going to significantly slow the issuance of any applications and petitions. And this is for legal immigration categories across the board. So this is kind of a great example of kind of one of those catch-all provisions that is shows that if you haven't been delayed by some other process, if they haven't taken staff away enough for the visa that you want, if you haven't been able to apply for it, if an employer is unwilling to sort of go through the hoops of trying to get you a visa, this is a last catch-all provision that is really going to stop the issuance of most visas coming out of USCIS. And then there are some very straightforward provisions in Project 2025, like they will just prohibit staff from working on programs like DACA or Uniting for Ukraine or refugee processing, and they're going to, quote unquote, refocus them on other programs. But these, I hope, are illustrating how we will see bureaucracy sort of used against itself to stop the churn of applications that the U.S. has really become so well known for. So the last thing that I want to highlight is twofold: this kind of state coercion angle, and how the administration is going to really weaponize federal funding to condition the states into what I kind of call total compliance. So the first example that I want to highlight is this proposal that will block federal financial aid for American college students if their state allows certain immigrant groups, that includes DACA recipients, to access in-state tuition. In the United States, access to in-state tuition has traditionally been a decision that is made state by state. State governments say, we want to extend in-state tuition to DACA recipients or undocumented students or nobody. But that has been a state-led decision. By conditioning the federal financial aid for all American college students on this decision, they are, of course, saying that if you give in-state tuition to, for instance, DACA recipients, we will pull all of that federal financial aid. Our calculations indicate that that will impact about 10.7 million American students who are enrolled in higher education in the states that allow DACA recipients to access in-state tuition. And of note, California, Texas, and New York have the largest student populations in the country, and they all permit not just DACA recipients, but even undocumented students to access in-state tuition. And then the final example that I want to highlight, because it is in the news as of late, is that there are other proposals in Project 2025 that require any state or local government recipient of Federal Emergency Management Agency funds. So those are FEMA funds that are we use for disasters in the United States. For instance, after cleanup from a devastating hurricane, they will require that all state and local governments are registered for and using EVerify, and that they have committed to total information sharing with the federal government. So I'm sure that most of the folks in your audience are well acquainted with all of the problems of EVerify. They incorrectly report unauthorized workers are legal more than half of the time. Their overall error rate is extremely high. And it's not actually often enforced, even in the places where it has been implemented at a state level. Alabama, Arizona, Mississippi, South Carolina, even in some of those states, it is used less than half the time because it is so unreliable. And then the information sharing aspect of that is really the federal government is trying to access things like all the information that we give to our state level Department of Motor Vehicles. So that includes your license data, ID data, photographs, names, addresses, any information that is collected by the state, the federal government intends to use for law enforcement and immigration enforcement purposes. So there's many, many things. I'll stop there, Celia. But I just want to kind of highlight that we have really been trying to say that this is a proposal that is only furthering the goals of a really small cohort of people. And it is going to be devastating for American businesses and families and economics and society, to say nothing of immigrants themselves.
Thank you very much, Kristie. It's almost unbelievable. Let me tell you, it's so dramatic, the change that you're talking about. But could you perhaps talk a bit more on the EVerify thing, the EVerify system? It is a system that is not used because it's full of flaws, or is it arbitrarily used to modify, a program, a policy, a person's procedure, permit to stay, whatever? Why should we care for the EVerify?
So it's for two reasons. It's really for both of those reasons. So the EVerify program was stood up so that the U.S. can better monitor who is working in the country legally. And the idea was that we want to put the impetus on employers to make sure that their employees are legally authorized to work in the United States. So the EVerify system was stood up. A handful of states have implemented it at a state level and require 100% compliance by all of their employers across the United States. We have seen there are a handful of other employers in other states that choose to do this at different levels of usage. But we have seen that the databases that are relied upon for this kind of information, namely the Social Security Administration and the Department of Homeland Security, often have extremely outdated information. And so not only do they get results that say that, someone is not authorized to work in the United States when they actually are, we actually get more returns that say that somebody is not authorized to work when they actually are authorized to work. So we've even found in these states that have really high levels of compliance requirements, 100% compliance requirement, that they don't use it because it's not actually effectuating the goals that they are trying to effectuate.
Right.
And employers don't like it. It's very expensive.
I bet they don't. Thank you, Kristie. Very, very interesting. Héctor, you care to say something?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Kristie, for that very clear explanation of what is a very abstruse document. It's 900 and something pages long, but I think it is. I was struck by how in its structure, it's structured really in bureaucratic language. Mm-hmm. The organization is bureaucratic. It's by department. Mm-hmm. And so you really have to read through all the fine details to get a broad sense, right? It's not by topic. It's by right. Bureaucracy. And then, as you mentioned with some of the examples that you had, it's a very, very sophisticated document in the sense that it knows how to, and you use the expression weaponize the bureaucracy. It understands, or the authors really understand the way bureaucracy works. Mm-hmm. And how you can make everything grind to a halt, right, quite easily by just mm-hmm. Inserting certain requirements, right? And you can also create extremely large impacts with just a couple of words. I'll give you an example that struck me was in one of the sections they talk about, and it's not even the main section, it's just like the afterthought about what agencies have to collaborate with the Department of Homeland Security. And one of the things that it says is that the Department of Labor should eliminate 2 of the 4 lowest wage levels for yes. legal immigrants, right? Just look at that. It's very simple. It's just 2 words. We're just going to eliminate 2 of the lower levels. Mm-hmm. What's the impact of that, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, enormous impact. Yes. Basically, all of the lower end, workers, legal workers, is just gone. They're just gone, right? So it's a document with enormous impacts. I really think of it as a deeply subversive document, in the sense that it is very specifically targeted to subvert the function of the functions of the current bureaucracy, and even to strategically move programs from one place to another in search of a more favorable bureaucracy. Like, for example, they move a set of issues that are right now with the Department of Justice, and they move it to Homeland Security, right? Mm-hmm. So I just wonder what your impression is of what level of understanding of the bureaucracy went into developing this?
Yeah, I mean, you've brought up a couple of really good points, and it is something that is so important to emphasize, especially, in the US with policymakers, who have been listening to kind of the rhetoric of Donald Trump for a long, long time, but feel as though they sort of know how to navigate it. And this time around, that navigation is going to look really different, because these aren't just sort of ideologues that are informing the way that President Trump talks about immigration or responds to immigration. These are people with a deep-seated knowledge about how government works and how to stop government from working. And I think you're exactly right in sort of calling out the breadth of this document. There is so much more in all of the other policy areas, but one of the things that comes to mind to effectuate all of these changes is the proposed change to Schedule F, which would basically allow for us to fire government employees much more easily. And that is all in furtherance of a much smaller but more concentrated and powerful federal government. And I think that is very much at the root of what this entire plan is. But it is not the kind of document that a lot of media wants to write about. It is dry. It is boring. You have to work through the entire thing to really get a full grasp of everything that has been proposed. I am really thankful that, folks like you and even to the media now to some extent are diving in and are doing some of that difficult work, because it is going to be these things that change, that have the really tangible impacts to immigration in the US that people are going to feel moving forward.
And bureaucracy is becoming politicized in that sense.
Absolutely. Yep, I think that is absolutely right.
Hector.
Right. And there are very specific recommendations, actually mandates, to the entering government here, where they say, and they go agency by agency, and they say, okay, in this agency, we want to fire this group of bureaucrats, and we want to replace them with loyalists. And they very specifically say who it is. Yes. I forget one, but was like the whole top tier of lawyers in the Justice Department, for example. They want to get rid of that whole top tier. Why? Because they're the ones who stop things from happening that they want to happen, right? So they're like they've identified them. This is the famous deep state, right? But it's bureaucrats who are already there, career bureaucrats who understand the laws and they're gatekeepers. And so they say, get rid of the gatekeepers. Let's fill them with new staff who are loyal. It's really, I mean, it reminds you of some of the most terrific, and I don't say that in the good way, regimes of the past. Going back to the Second World War and so forth, and communist countries, with exactly what happened, right?
I agree with you, and that's to say nothing of the entire departments that have been axed or proposed to be axed in this document, and things that you wouldn't imagine have any kind of political leaning, like NOAA. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which just releases weather data and tracks important weather events like hurricanes that, the United States is especially paying close attention to these past few weeks. So it is across the board a reimagining of what the federal government looks like. But importantly, it is not so that we are reducing the size of federal government because we think that more power should be invested in the states, which is a more traditional conservative take on the way the government should work. This is the opposite of that. It is reducing the size of federal government so it is concentrated more in one person who is surrounded, like you said, Hector, by loyalists.
Kristie, no. Please go ahead.
I was just gonna make a parallel, because in Mexico we have seen some very significant policy impacts that have happened exactly in this way. So you can't change the law. You don't have the majorities to change the law. So then what you go down one level and you look at the bureaucracy and you say, for example, yes, we have this program, we have these reforms, these energy reforms that say that you have to auction electricity and that you have to bring out for auction exploration blocks, for petroleum. All you have to do is just say, I'm just not going to do it. Right? So you haven't changed the law. You just all the bureaucracy, just don't do it. Don't issue any more. Don't issue any more auction plans. And this is the same thing that we see here. They're basically saying in parts of the document saying exactly that. Just don't do what you're supposed to do.
I was wondering, in this reshuffling of tasks and duties within the bureaucracy, who will be the winner? It seems like DHS, isn't that so? Like the Department of Homeland Security is becoming such a powerful, monumental administration in and of itself. Does that make sense or not?
Yes, it does. There's been a lot of people looking at the Department of Homeland Security because it has grown so substantially since its formation in 2002. We in the immigration space often think about, that it is kind of the home of so much immigration policy. It's sort of easy to forget that Homeland Security also covers, the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. It's also in charge of issuing FEMA funds and disaster relief. I mean, it's in charge of our Secret Service, for instance, that is under the gun after 2 assassination attempts on a former president. It is difficult to envision an agency that could be broader in scope than the one that we have now. But ultimately, what they're doing is ensuring that whoever heads up DHS will sort of be a lackey for President Trump, who is very well versed in how to sort of stop all of this, and is going to be the kind of right hand to what it is that the White House wants to do. And I think that's especially true given the more recent Supreme Court decisions that we have had on a doctrine that we refer to as the Chevron doctrine, which previously gave agencies a lot of latitude on what they wanted to do, but now there's going to be more specific regulations, arguably, that are going to have to come from Congress and then implemented by the agencies. But I think this is an extension of the president trying to do a little bit less via executive action and more through an agency like the Department of Homeland Security. I also think that they are going to rely really heavily, and it will probably be an extremely expensive endeavor on state and local law enforcement to implement and execute a lot of these proposals. We have seen in the past that has cost state and local law enforcement a lot of money, both in the actual execution of it, because they have limited personnel right now, but also in the lawsuits that have emerged from improperly enforcing federal law. And some of those have resulted in very, very large claims and settlement agreements with people that have been improperly, for instance, detained by state and local law enforcement.
You're muted, Celia.
No, I was wondering, sorry, thank you. If you want to keep on, you want to continue with the discussion, or shall we go to questions? What do you feel like doing?
No, sure. I mean, I was this type of proposal. Do you see any legal challenges if assuming that you had a second Trump administration and they began to implement this, and I believe that they would try, because as you mentioned before, they did implement many of the recommendations in the previous version of this, so they're probably going to try. How given that a lot of this is in the realm of the bureaucracy and within executive executive order power, or even lower level powers of the executive through the secretary's power. Do you see a lot of legal challenges coming around these positions, or is it going to be very difficult to challenge these kinds of measures legally?
It's such a good question, and given the level of legal challenges that we saw in the last administration, and frankly, even in this administration, I think the answer is absolutely yes. The bigger question is whether and how successful those challenges will be. We've seen a Supreme Court that has been pretty deferential to presidential power. We haven't seen the extent of some of the decisions on that deference to presidential power. I think that we'll see a lot of that if we do have a second Trump administration. One of the most interesting impacts, though, that I see personally is the role that Mexico will have in determining whether or not some of the policies of this administration, of a second Trump administration, would be successful. I think that Mexico has been sort of an underrated but incredibly important partner in assisting the Biden administration on controlling arrivals on the southern border. I won't venture guesses about what the new president will plan to do, but I imagine that she will be less than enthused about implementing a lot of the changes that the Trump administration is going to try to strong arm Mexico into doing. And I think that there is a really powerful role to be played by arguably our most important neighbor in this hemisphere in helping control and manage migration between North and South America. And I think, too, that Mexico plays an incredibly important part in the labor that comes to the United States. And there are still so many Mexican Americans in the United States. I myself am one. And I think that a lot of those pieces of the puzzle are going to come to light and are going to influence in a lot of really important ways how successful some of these challenges are, because it won't just be a challenge on the substance of the law, but we will actually be able to have plaintiffs challenging some of the impacts of these laws, which, just based on our experience from the last administration, were far and away the most successful lawsuits that I think that we saw. And so I am hoping that those would be successful again.
So in the last time around, all it took to goad the Mexican government into compliance was an overblown threat to impose a 25% tariff on all Mexican goods, right? It was, at that time, it was, I think many of us thought it was a bluff, but the Mexican government didn't think so. And they very quickly, I think that Trump said, what was it, folded or something like that? What was the expression that he used? Something like that. But the Mexican government basically folded and agreed to the Remain in Mexico program, to reduction to a stepped up presence of Mexican law enforcement on the southern border, et cetera, lots of things. So this time around, there's also a lot of pressure that a new Trump administration could pose, because USMCA is up for review in a couple of years, and that's going to be a pressure point. So I'm wondering whether the Mexican government, now under a new president, has the wherewithal to withstand these kinds of pressures and to be able to have a forceful response if many of these things are put in place.
I mean, certainly, I speaking for myself, I certainly hope so. It's a really important question, and it's one that's hard to answer. But, we saw, first of all, it's not the first time that anybody in the world will be interacting with a President Trump. And I think that experience is really important. It's important to understand where and how he bluffs. It's important to understand what the administration is, going to want to do, what they talk about wanting to do, how those things differ. So I think that we do have more clarity about when a President Trump is bluffing and maybe when he's not. Now, it's certainly not to the level of certainty, but it is some clarity that I think is important. I think the other really important change between the last time around and this time around is that the tariff regime is going to be incredibly costly for Americans. And with inflation still high in America, the bulk of people that would be voting for a President Trump are doing so for economic reasons. And we have seen and we anticipate that, higher tariffs are going to amount to higher annual tax increases for most Americans. And that's to say nothing of how it changes the Americans' behaviors as it relates to spending. And there are many, many studies out there by many people smarter than me, people that have PhDs like you, Hector, who are looking at the way that is going to change behavior and really cost Americans. And I think that is a really important aspect. And we saw a glimmer of this when Governor Greg Abbott of Texas tried to close the border for a handful of days, how quickly and thoroughly that backfired and how mad people got very quickly about not being able to engage in commerce with Mexico, and how quickly that decision was reversed. And I think at the end of the day, those economic impacts are going to be incredibly powerful levers to kind of force President Trump to maybe rethink or reconsider some of the things that sound really tough on the campaign trail, but in actuality are not the kinds of policies that are going to make life in America better for Americans, certainly.
If I may say something quickly, I do think this pressure response model is simply not exactly, it doesn't capture the whole reality of what's going on. The number of asylum seekers that reach the U.S. southern border varies with two very main variables. Without any doubt, is the Mexican policy of preventing many of them from reaching the border. But the other incredibly important, even more important, is U.S. asylum policy. Right. So maybe we should look into how is that likely to change. One of the questions, in fact, 2 or 3 people that have asked questions, there's a list of good questions, say, how will, in the case that this time around, deportations or removals are really tough or massive, or closing the border, etc., how are they likely to affect U.S.-Mexican relations and U.S.-Latin American relations? Most of the asylum seekers are not Mexicans. The large majority are coming from Latin America. So that's one of the questions. Perhaps you care to say something about the asylum policy and the likely changes on that, which is not exactly the topic of today's webinar, but still. And I was wondering if I may ask just another question. This is not meant to stop undocumented workers from working in the U.S. This is not meant to stop the flow of migrants going without authorization into the U.S. And we know this opening and closing of the border. If there was a moment when that border was closed, that was COVID. That was the pandemic. And even then, that's the origin of the enlargement of the H-2A visas. It's just we still need the essential workers, and they will still be crossing. So at some point, one thinks, well, Donald Trump said in his first term that he would deport 11 million undocumented migrants. He did not. You know that Biden has removed more people than Obama and, of course, Trump. Biden has removed the largest number, and nobody says anything. So this aggressive rhetoric is, or are we confronting, as Hector was suggesting, a major change in U.S. politics? Because in order to do that, you do have to really affect the checks and balances in U.S. society. And are moving into an authoritarian populist are we abandoning the liberal model in the U.S.? I mean, how serious is this? Or is this Trump? You said it at the beginning. This is not Trump reloaded. This is different. Well, we usually think of a second term as lame duck, don't we? Why should this time be different? Or we are not seeing what's going on, and this is a major departure of U.S. politics as we know it.
There are a lot of really good questions there. I'm going to try to answer a handful of them. I think on the issue of deportations and repatriations, there is an incredibly important and difficult issue that is going to arise. For the vast majority of recent years, Mexico has accepted deportees that are not Mexican. There is definitely a realistic environment where Mexico decides not to do that any longer. And then even if the kind of mass deportation architecture gets off the ground, there is almost nowhere that will accept nationals that are not their own nationals. And in many cases, these countries won't even accept their own nationals. So we are stuck in a very difficult predicament for effectuating this idea of mass deportation. And that's to say nothing of all of the legal challenges that we'll have to go through our immigration courts, which are incredibly backlogged before any person is deported. And I imagine that there will be a flood of lawyers, immigration lawyers and other lawyers who are willing to sort of step in and gum up those works as much as they can. So there's certainly a piece there. On the asylum law, there was a bipartisan effort that was led by a very conservative senator from Oklahoma, paired with a Democrat senator, Chris Murphy, that put together what I think is a pretty strong border security package that was also coupled with the kind of investments that we need in improving infrastructure and building personnel and doing the many things that we know we need to do to change what arrivals look like on the southern border. And President Trump tanked that effort. This issue in this moment is much more valuable to him as an issue that he can campaign on than it is for him to actually solve this issue. That said, there does seem to be a lot of interest by both parties in figuring out what this border solution looks like. So, would I bet my life on a border bill being passed in the next couple of years? I wouldn't, but I do think that there is a high likelihood that especially, that a President Trump or even a President Harris can kind of lead in this and get at least that one piece done. And that, I think you're exactly right. That does have an enormous impact on the way people move. On the danger of Trump to sort of our democracy and liberalism in the United States, I think there are varying degrees of alarm from very, very smart people across the board. I, being a very pragmatic, center, moderate person myself, I think that there are pretty significant risks to the checks and balances in our government if we have a president that is really hell-bent on undermining our courts and our elections and our executive branch in the way that President Trump has talked about doing. And I think that it is a threat that really can't be overstated in this moment. Do I think that is insurmountable if he is elected, that we can save our democracy and continue to lead with the kind of values that have made America what it is today? I do think that we can absolutely do that, but it is going to be difficult and it will not be an easy road. So I am hopeful that the American people are really listening to some of this and are really thinking about what it is that is important to them. And we will have a Harris administration as opposed to a Trump administration that can actually tackle the big policy problems that we have in front of us.
Let's hope for that. If I may ask a very peculiar question, a very nice question by a Canadian professor who's listening, Julian Castorrea. He says, who is the contact person between Trump and Heritage? I mean, is the Heritage Foundation really very influential? Or high?
Well, there have been a lot of videos that have surfaced and comments that President Trump has made about the president of the Heritage Foundation. Vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance did some opening remarks for a Heritage Foundation event from a couple of months ago. The campaign, however, today is absolutely saying that they do not endorse and have never supported anything in Project 2025. Although many of the authors, which you can find right on the opening pages of Project 2025, you will see were former administration officials who or have very, very close ties to the former president. So it is not a difficult sort of string theory to piece together. But I do understand why the campaign would want to distance itself in this moment.
Okay. If I made the last question that is in the, well, there are others, but I put them sort of together, is our immigration, civil society, in particular immigration groups, reacting to the 2025 project, the 2025? Are they already sort of talking about it?
Increasingly so, and it's been a really welcome change this fall. A lot of folks just haven't been attuned to what the Heritage Foundation has been writing for many good reasons, but they are very attuned to it now and are really paying attention. And I think one of the nice things about that increased focus is that, there are, climate folks that are really focused on the climate pieces of it. There are people that are looking at the Department of Justice. There are people that are looking at some of the immigration aspects. And there are a lot of people that are taking a broad vision of this. Perhaps one of the most comforting things this time around, and Hector, this goes back to a good point that you made, is that there are a lot of litigators from a lot of different civil society organizations and states all over the country that are really looking at how they are going to challenge some of these initial impacts, I think in a really thoughtful and organized way. It's going to be less about kind of fighting for your own space in every one of these issues and more about kind of diversifying the skills and the kinds of challenges that people might want to bring in certain areas of the country where they will be more successful versus, less successful. And I think that's an important piece of this strategy. And I've been comforted a bit, but civil society is definitely reaching out. And I think increasingly the more conversations like this that we can have. And I'm really grateful to be able to speak with you all today and to hear some of your insights about Project 2025 as well. I think the better.
Thank you. Thank you, Kristie. Hector, you want to say something to close this webinar?
Well, I just want to reiterate what Kristie just said. Well, we have to pay attention to this stuff, right? We have to wade through the drudgery of a 900-page document like this, right, which is hard to do these days when we're all used to the 3-minute TikTok, right? And that's about as much as we can gather in terms of attention span. But these are important things, and this is a roadmap with very detailed roadmap for some very damaging things, not just to immigrants and immigration, but also to the future of the United States. I mean, what is one of the greatest assets that the United States has, especially when you compare it to other industrialized countries? It's the demographic base. And its demographic base is absolutely dependent on a continued flow of immigrants, younger, hardworking, within working age, to sustain its economy. Even if you forget about humanitarianism and our sort of our better selves, even just from self-interest, the U.S. needs to continue to have immigration as an important part of its makeup, and these kinds of proposals really fly in the face of that. So, very important document to read. Thank you, Kristie, for reading it.
Of course, thank you too.
Yeah. Well. Tell us in a moment, what's the worst case scenario? What's the worst
Oh
thing
my
that could
gosh. You're going to make me leave on a note of saying the worst case scenario?
No, just thinking, you know what I think is the worst case scenario? Nothing dramatic. No 10 million people being, no, the border closing, no, nothing of that kind of thing. But rather just a systematic daily pushing away migrants, Hispanics, and make sure they don't advance, make sure they don't become part of the US, make sure that they don't become part of the people, they don't have political rights, sort of slowly but surely leaving them where they are, pushing them down. This would be, for me, the worst case scenario for the Mexicans, for the Hispanics, for the migrants, and for the US, who will have to accept second-class citizens, if at all citizens. That's really awful.
I think that's right, but I think the flip side of that is that I think for me the worst case scenario is, of course, that happening, but that people just give up. And they just sort of take these changes as inevitable, and they just allow these things to sort of happen.
Get tired of fighting.
It's just a slow march of desensitization. And I think that is the absolute worst case. I don't envision that happening in America. If nothing else, Americans are, always up in arms about something. And I'm hopeful that they will continue to be up in arms about, really important issues. But that for me is, I think, the worst case scenario. But I have hope. I am optimistic.
I'm happy to hear that. So if you agree with me, Alejandra, shall we close the seminar? Shall we find another question?
Oh, thanks. I think we're on the time.
Okay. So
thank you.
Let me thank you then, Kristie De Peña. Thank you very, very much. Héctor Cárdenas, how can I thank you more? Thank you, Alejandra. Thank you, COMEXI. And I hope COMEXI and Niskanen Center can keep on working together, discussing these issues that are so relevant.
Absolutely. Yes. Okay. Thank you again. It was an honor.
Thank you to all. See you later and have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.